Hi, everyone. So my name's Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester, and we're here to talk about some, I think, pretty cool restoration work at the LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest in Hinesburg. Um, Here with Annalise Carington, who's a conservation planner for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Partners in Fish and Wildlife Program, and Gus Goodwin from the Nature Conservancy as a senior conservation planner. And we're here because we've all been working together on this project. The LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest, I'll tell you a little bit more about it. It's a really neat property that also has some significant conservation challenges. And I think through partnership and some innovative strategies, we've been able to at least put it on the road to recovery. And so with that, I'm going to give you a little overview. Then I'll pass it off to Annalise. Annalise will pass it off to Gus. Gus will pass it back to me. And then at the very end, we'll have some time for questions. And so we're going to hold all the questions to the end. As things come up, just pop them in the chat box, which you can find at the bar at the bottom of your screen, and we will address them at the end. So with that, I'll share my screen. All right. So we called it Restoration and Innovation at the LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest, just because I think both those words are a big part of what we're doing, thinking of ways to sort of restore LaPlatte from situations it's been put in largely by human land use and human activities, and restore it into a more healthy, diverse, complex forest with great wildlife habitat that can also contribute positively to water quality in the Lake Champlain Basin and aquatic habitat and all that good stuff. And doing so, I think, through some innovative partnerships and also innovative approaches, which you're going to hear more about in a second. To give you an overview, LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest, it's 301 acres. Of those 301 acres, about 130 are these areas in the northern part of it. I think we call it the riparian parcel. It's a special treatment area. And it's fields, historic floodplains, historic wetlands, largely dominated right now by reed canary grass, which is an invasive exotic grass. This property was acquired by the town in 2007 as part of this larger conservation area project that led to a bunch of different areas being conserved. The goal was, among other things, protecting water quality and aquatic habitat in the headwaters of the LaPlatte River, which is a major tributary to Lake Champlain in Shelburne Bay. And at the time, it was also known to be the northernmost nesting colony of Indiana bat, which is a federally endangered species. So there's a lot of good reasons to conserve this property at that time. And there's also other parts of this project, thanks to the Hinesburg Land Trust and the Trust for Public Land and others, that are also conserved, but held by private landowners. So here we are in the LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest. If you guys are familiar with the Hinesburg Town Forest, what we might call the Old Town Forest, which is 864 acres, very much in the sort of Green Mountains area up in the hills. This is much more a Champlain Valley property, and you can see that it's on sort of the eastern edge of the fragmented Champlain Valley, just southeast of Hinesburg Village. And comprising, and sort of as that valley joins with that northern Green Mountain region, which is those intact blocks of forest that you see to the east of the property. The property here is denoted by that purple boundary line. This project has been ongoing, or the process of trying to restore LaPlatte, and especially those floodplain areas, has been ongoing for a long time, long before I was a county forester. Between 2007 and 2010, some riparian plantings were done. You can see, if you go out there, some of these trees, some of them are actually recently felled by beavers, but some of these trees are doing pretty good. Some of them are doing not as well. That work was funded by the NRCS and others. Some of these ditches that you can actually see on this aerial photo, moving from, this is 116 here, and moving west from 116 and west from Gilman Road are these pretty major ditches. Some of those were plugged. And we threw some trees at it over the last few years, trying to get some plantings done and trying to spur the regeneration of these areas, which, as you can see, are pretty much open fields that are not easily, regenerating into a mix of native species. We did that with the help of the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps and their watershed program, the Winooski Natural Resource Conservation District, and others, 2017 through 2019. Some of these have been somewhat successful. There are some shrub plantings especially that have been pretty successful. Some of them have been confounded by reed canary grass, which Annalise is going to talk more about, and deer browse, among other issues. We definitely have a very high deer population out there. And so in 2018, we reached out to a couple of different partners. So we reached out to the Nature Conservancy, hoping we could get some support from their American Elm Restoration Project, which Gus is going to talk more about. And in early 2019, we reached out to Annalise and the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program. It says of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Survey. It should say of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. At that time, Annalise was looking for an area to do some cool experimentation and reed canary grass remediation. And so with that, I will hand it off to Annalise. Oh, and I'll stop sharing my screen so I can. There you go.
Thank you, Ethan. Let me share my screen. All right, is that coming through? So like Ethan said, my name is Annalise Carington, and I work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here in Vermont, specifically with the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program, which is the part of the Fish and Wildlife Service that works on private lands through local partnerships. We work statewide, but a lot of our work has been focused in the Champlain Valley of Vermont. So tonight I want to tell a story of some innovative work that we've been doing at LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest and a few other sites across the Champlain Valley to trial some new techniques for floodplain forest restoration, some alternative approaches to traditional tree plantings. And this has been a really exciting project of late that has just grown exponentially in the last year, with LaPlatte Headwaters being one of our keystone projects. So just a brief outline. I want to give a little more context for the importance of restoring floodplain forest, a little bit more context in the Champlain Valley in particular, speak to how we came to this, this new innovative strategy for restoration. Then I plan to outline the work that we're doing at LaPlatte Headwaters, some of our initial results from the season, and how we're looking ahead to work next season. So as Ethan mentioned, floodplain forests are incredibly important aspects of the landscape. In Vermont, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has focused on wetland and floodplain riparian forest restoration, working with partners including local watershed groups, towns and municipalities, a lot of private landowners. But in the last few years, this work has received a lot of funding, primarily in the name of protecting water quality, but there are a lot of other essential reasons listed here that make these riparian areas a high priority for a lot of the fish and wildlife species that the Fish and Wildlife Service cares about and works to protect, along with a lot of ecosystem services that we all benefit from, including attenuating flooding, protecting water quality in Lake Champlain, sequestering carbon, and many more. So our primary approach the last few years to restoring these areas has been tree and shrub plantings, which Ethan mentioned. But what we've found at the majority of these sites is that they suffer from high mortality, specifically in the Champlain Valley, from two key things: deer browse, and also the prevalence of the invasive exotic reed canary grass. So the photos I included on the left are a couple of examples of deer browse, and what you end up getting is severely stunted trees if they're able to survive. So this is an example of, believe it or not, a 13-year-old oak tree that has persisted but has been stunted season after season by persistent deer browse. And just before we got on the call, Ethan was talking about population densities in different parts of the state, and right near the LaPlatte Headwaters site, he was talking about over 30 deer an acre at a lot of these areas. So really large populations that have been really challenging for establishing trees and shrubs. And then you have reed canary grass, which is a invasive exotic grass that back in the 80s was actually a species that was that farmers were encouraged to plant in these wetland areas when there was a lot of wetland and floodplain conversion happening for agriculture because of how well it establishes on wet sites. And because of that and how persistent it is on the landscape, we've seen reed canary grass take over a lot of these old sites. And the way that it grows is that it forms these dense single species stands that outcompete anything else, any other native species. And once it's established, it creates this dense mat of thatch that prevents the seeds of any other species getting down to reach bare soil to germinate. So a really difficult species to contend with when we're thinking of trying to restore these riparian areas back to the historic floodplain forest that was once there. And often at these sites, it takes a pretty dramatic disturbance event to alter site conditions. So believe it or not, it was actually our observations of old cornfields that has provided the inspiration for this project that we're now calling site preparation and direct seeding. But really, ultimately, what we're trying to do is kill back that invasive reed canary grass and expose bare earth and allow for the direct seeding of the native tree and shrub species that we're trying to establish. So I'll just show you some photos to help you understand what this looks like on the landscape and why the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other partners in the state have been so impressed with and excited about this method. So in the upper left-hand corner, you have an old cornfield. This was in 2016. This is a site along the Winooski River in Colchester. So if you follow the progression, the following year, there was a really impressive recruitment of native floodplain species, including silver maple and cottonwood and box elder, which is now a naturalized species in a lot of our floodplains in Vermont. And then fast forward to 2019, so only 3 years later, you have the makings of a young forest. That's one of our colleagues with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, actually, who's also been a partner in this work. So I'll just show a few more to really hit this home. So this is a site, also former corn ground. Now the rest of the field is in hay, but that forest edge, the buffer, was in corn ground. This was in 2011, and then the picture on the right was in 2018. So just, 7 years later, 8 years later, and you have a really remarkable forest. And this was actually a site that I visited when I was doing monitoring work at our tree planting projects. And we were looking at projects 10 years after planting. And at the majority of those sites, it was really difficult to find the trees that we had tagged because either they were dead or they had been so severely stunted by deer browse that they were buried under thatch, or any number of reasons. But at this site, it was actually really hard to find our trees because they were just swallowed by forest. So it was hard to tell what we had planted and what had just recruited in naturally. And then one more. So this is cottonwood, which is actually one of the primary species that we're working with at LaPlatte for establishment. And again, just the really striking difference here in what you see as the result of this more passive restoration work, I would call it, where you end up with a true floodplain forest in the makings. So in a nutshell, that's what this project is. How do we get from the condition on the left, reed canary dominant, to the condition on the right, where we have bare earth that we can, that will allow for direct seeding. And just one thing to add here, so this concept is essentially replicating natural disturbance. So if you imagine a large flood event that would occur in these historic floodplains that deposits a significant amount of silt, and then you have that bare seedbed. So we actually weren't the only ones to notice this phenomenon. So it was in the winter of 2019, that the same year that we connected with Ethan and then ultimately connected with LaPlatte Headwaters, that I was connecting with some of our colleagues with Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and the same concept came up. And this is actually a slide from one of their presentations, where they had gone so far as to document recruitment, so number of seedlings per hectare, in this example, at corn ground plots relative to hay and pasture. So that, that one graph really tells it all. And they had the same research question: can we replicate this condition to restore floodplain forest? So this was an exciting connection to make. And we decided to join forces to find some more sites, particularly in the Champlain Valley, where we could be testing these methods and expanding this work. Because ultimately, if we can get this to, if we can be successful in this effort, it will be more cost effective. The cost of planting an individual stem can be upwards of $8 a stem. So very expensive when you're thinking about restoring multiple acres. And you can also ideally establish sites at a density that's high enough that you can overwhelm other site pressures like deer browse. And you don't have transplant shock from planting bare root. You're working to control invasives, and ultimately you have a more natural and resilient forest as the result of this restoration. So that same winter, I was catching up with Ethan and telling him about this work and how we were looking for sites in the Champlain Valley. And he said, I know a site with a lot of reed canary grass and that also has a lot of deer. And he suggested that we go out and look at the LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest in Hinesburg. And it became clear really quickly that this was going to be a great site for us to be expanding this work. And we chose the northernmost field of the town forest off of 116 to establish our trials. And beyond being a great site in terms of the site conditions, we have also been so grateful for a partner in the town forest committee that is so willing and excited to have an experiment like this happen at their town forest. So what I hope becomes clear tonight through this presentation is that this town forest has really become a demonstration site for various novel techniques and innovative techniques that will really be a benefit to restoration practitioners across the state, and already has been. And it has facilitated partnerships and provided a platform for us to share this work more broadly in presentations like tonight. So what does this work actually look like? So like I mentioned, we had connected with Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and they had actually gone so far as to start trialing some of this work, but at a couple of wildlife management areas up in the Northeast Kingdom. So very far afield, and it took some time for that work to, for us to find out about it. And essentially, we are turning to traditional farming techniques to replicate that same condition of bare earth. So we're haying, we're plowing and tilling, and we're using herbicide. And in that, you know, this is very experimental still. So we are basing the work at LaPlatte Headwaters off of what was seen to be most successful with those initial trials that I mentioned that Vermont Fish and Wildlife completed up in the kingdom. So we're basically looking at haying, or we hayed the entire field, which we found very important to remove the thatch, like I mentioned, that the invasive reed canary grass forms. And then we were comparing a few different methods to replicate disturbance. So the first was just an herbicide application. And then we looked at what would happen if we just plowed the ground. And then we looked at what would happen if we plowed and then let the reed canary rebound for a little bit, and then also do an herbicide application. So all of those things we're looking at, we're trying to get at which is the most successful at creating bare earth conditions. And then we had enough replicates here that we were able to compare both natural regeneration, so just a control for these sites, and also direct seeding. So the concept of direct seeding was kind of in addition to this, based on what Vermont Fish and Wildlife saw. So I'll try to be brief here, being mindful of time, but essentially they noticed a large difference between the plots that they established. These are two pictures from, or two site maps from those WMA sites in the kingdom that I mentioned. So the sites that were adjacent to the forest or to the tree line saw much better recruitment, which you would imagine, whereas the sites in the middle of the field saw very little recruitment of trees and shrubs. So how do we introduce seed at sites where we don't have a proximate seed source? So did a little digging, and believe it or not, this is something that other people have thought of, and there's actually ample literature and some examples of places both in the US and also abroad. I connected with someone in Australia out of Melbourne that's been doing some of this direct seeding work as well, but also some really cool work in the upper left in the Colorado River Basin in the southwestern US and in Minnesota, which has more similar conditions to where we are. So a lot of my work in, I guess it was spring of, well, just this past spring, was ramping up seed collection. We realized pretty quickly that if we were going to be working on several acres, which is the case for LaPlatte, that we were going to need quite a bit of seed. So we were targeting eastern cottonwood, which is what is being showed on screen here, but also some different willow species and quaking aspen and silver maple in this first year. So eastern cottonwood develops both male and female flowers. The female flowers develop into these seed pods, and then the seeds are attached to the fluff, and that's what we were aiming to collect. And yeah, this was definitely kind of trial by fire. Like this was new. You know, how could we collect a ton of seed efficiently? So we ended up clipping a bunch of seed pods, drying them out in bags, and then collecting the fluff. And it was sort of a whole thing, but also a really fun part of the project, and really cool to get to go to a lot of places around the Champlain Valley to scout for seed collection. And these are some photos from the willow collection. They have a really similar morphology with the pods that then produce seed that you collect. And then I just had to zoom in on this. It was so beautiful the way the pods would open. And then lastly, silver maple, which really involved a lot of like knocking on doors to ask to rake seed out of people's lawns. But we ultimately collected enough seed for about 4 acres at this site. Okay, so we had all the seed collected. This was, over the spring, and at that point I was working from home and kind of scrambling to get it together. We weren't sure if we were actually going to be able to seed with, delays with COVID and complications there. And we finally were able to, but it was delayed. But I did want to show one of the biggest takeaways from this season. So in the upper left is just a reminder of our plot design. And then these are conditions in May with the different preparation techniques. So where we just did an herbicide application, it was really effective at killing the reed canary grass, but there was still quite a bit of thatch. The plow only we found to be not very effective. It stunted it initially, but regrew. And then the plow and herbicide was highly effective at controlling reed canary and opened up quite a bit of bare soil. But we ultimately didn't end up seeding until mid-June, which was later than we had anticipated. These are just some photos of what the ground condition looked like when we were seeding, and some pictures of the hydro seeder setup, which I can talk more about in the Q&A. That was a whole other side of the project. But long story short, we got the seed out mid-June, which was later than we had hoped, and we ended up with poor germination success in the end. A combination of late season seeding. It was a wicked dry spell after we had seeded, 3 weeks basically with no rain. So that's one of our biggest takeaways from this season, is that the earlier you can get out and seed, the better. But we did see impressive results with controlling reed canary, which is huge. So just to briefly talk you through this, you have the stake that's separating 2 different plots. The left is where we only plowed, and then the right is where we plowed, but then also applied herbicide. So you'll notice as you trend through, this is like a time lapse basically. At the far right, you'll see ultimately how the site evolved, and it was like a checkerboard on the field. On the left, the reed canary grass, it was ultimately like 80% reed canary at the end of the season, and we had less than 5% reed canary on the section that we also applied herbicide. So we're pretty convinced that that's a pretty critical piece of this work. And this is just the same time lapse where we did herbicide only. So I'll just end with this. So we've gotten closer to honing in what techniques are most effective at controlling reed canary grass. And we also saw a pretty exciting transition in the vegetative composition that this is a blurb from State Fish and Wildlife's work that ultimately we think is going to persist down the road. So, you create this alternate stable state that's dominated by these native wet meadow species, and that's much more conducive to native tree germination. And we got permission from the Town Forest Committee to continue these trials into next year. So we've actually repeated that site preparation work with the hopes of seeding again this spring. So, okay, that was my attempt to cram a pretty complicated, winding project into 20 minutes, but look forward to more in the Q&A. And now I'll pass it off to Gus. I can close out of this.
All right. Well, Annalise, thank you for that run through. I don't think I will ever get tired of seeing that. It's such exciting work. All right, let me just pull up my notes here and I will get started. So my name is Gus Goodwin. I work at the Nature Conservancy in Vermont. My title is Senior Conservation Planner, and it's just a real pleasure to be here with Annalise and Ethan and to be speaking about some of the work that we're doing at the LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest. And I should start by saying that I kind of stumbled into this project. A colleague of mine at the Nature Conservancy, Dan Farrell, was the one who really engaged the Nature Conservancy with this site and designed the project that I'll be sharing today, and also fostered the great relationship that has made this project a joy for me to work on. So I want to thank Dan for his immense contributions to this project, and also I need to give credit to Ethan for initiating the relationship when he asked about the elm work. And I will talk about elms towards the end of my presentation. You know, for me, one of the highlights has really been this collaborative work. And I just am so excited by the work that Annalise is doing with the site prep and direct seeding. We've seen on our lands the same wonderful response of cornfields once you can walk away from them and there's good seed rain. And have not been able to replicate that same success with some of our restoration plantings. So I think it's really exciting, and it's so neat that this project that brought us together at LaPlatte Headwaters has kind of spurred this great working relationship, and I'm looking forward at our project pipeline, and we've been working with Annalise to evaluate that, and I think we aspire to be treating up to 300 acres in the next couple of years, but we'll see. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But I also should probably just quickly introduce the Nature Conservancy. We are the world's largest conservation organization, and we've been in Vermont for over 60 years. We just celebrated our anniversary last month. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters upon which all life depends. And most people, rightfully so, associate that mission with land protection. We have a big history of protection work in the state of Vermont. We've helped protect over 300,000 acres. We currently own 30,000 acres in 56 different natural areas, all of which are open to the public. And we have a great statewide footprint. And our work in restoration is both tied to the lands that we own to improve their condition. Even though we tend to try and acquire and protect the highest quality, greatest ecological integrity lands, there's still a lot of maintenance and work that needs to go into some of those properties. And then, of course, restoration is a really important tool in the toolbox if we want to think about our bigger picture goals for Vermont, to think about water quality, flood resilience, climate change adaptation, and of course, solving some of the nutrient problems associated with Lake Champlain. And the other thing we also think about is improving habitat connectivity between large forest blocks. Vermont sits at the crossroad of something like 8 regionally important wildlife linkages. So we really need to be thinking about how we can keep wildlife moving between our forest blocks, and restoration is a critical piece of that component. And so when Ethan reached out to us and asked us if there would be a few elms to spare for this project, we were really excited. And Dan and Rose, who both worked at the Nature Conservancy, really kind of waded in and developed the project that I'm about to share next. And so I want to thank Ethan for that, and then also say that the timing really worked out well. And I think that when Ethan reached out, not only were we in the kind of throes of this large American elm restoration project, we had also just worked with a UVM grad student to do a kind of retrospective analysis of one of our flagship restoration projects. And what I'm showing you now is the map of seedling mortality from that big project. This is 105 acres of land, very similar to the LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest in that it's degraded agricultural land, it's hayfield, there's a lot of reed canary grass, it's hydrologically altered, lots of deer pressure. And over the course of a decade, we planted 40,000 trees using the best available guidance on how to do the planting and site prep. And you can see there's a lot of red on this map. There's a lot of mortality. Almost 75% of those planted trees died. And the rest are limited by deer browse. So think back to that picture that Annalise showed of that tiny stunted oak. Many of those trees look like that. And so, it's tough to look at a map like this and not ask why, and try and think about, what are the reasons that we had this kind of variable success and what are the factors that are limiting the establishment of trees as we're planting them. And what we found is that there are lots and lots of different factors, and Annalise described many of them. And the list is long. There's soil conditions, there's hydrology, there's deer, there's voles, there's road salt, there's soil chemistry as a result of the agricultural history. And what we found was that it was very hard in a retrospective analysis to try and pin down any of those. So with these questions on our mind, when we thought about, and Dan especially, when we were thinking about engaging with this project and doing some restoration planting, we wanted to take a little bit more of a proactive approach to thinking about those questions. And we were lucky to connect with some UVM students, particularly a woman named Morgan Southgate, who's now a PhD student at UVM in plant biology. And thinking about kind of inverting that question, right? So if there are all these factors that might limit the success of planted trees on a site, many of those would be difficult to measure, but we have a clue in the vegetation. So the existing vegetation on the site may hold some answers to those very fine scale variations in site quality that predict seedling success. So these students, they mapped the LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest, looking at the existing vegetation and looking at some soil characteristics. So you'd be forgiven for driving by a site like this and thinking it's all the same. And that was personally really eye-opening when they mapped this site to see the variation they were able to find. And so what they did is they spent quite a bit of time out there doing a whole series of plots, and they came up with these different cover type associations, and they used statistics to kind of ordinate them out, and they're tied to a couple of soil properties, most importantly, depth to modeling. So what they've found are these different types of vegetation throughout the hayfield that indicate different microsite environments, particularly different soil conditions. And so our planting design wants to build on that knowledge. So what we have identified from their mapping is 13 acres that we're going to plant. We were awarded a grant from the Department of Environmental Conservation, their water quality money, to purchase the trees. And so we'll be planting a huge variety of tree species. I think we have 19 different species, about 2,000 different stems that we're going to plant in a stratified fashion in each of these cover types. So representatives of each tree species will be in each cover type. And so we'll be able to look at the way that the existing vegetation can predict the success of tree plantings and help you figure out which species are best suited for particular sites. So it's pretty exciting to think about being able to walk into these fields and appreciate those microsite vegetation, or those microsite characteristics evidenced by the vegetation, to help you really fine tune your planting success or your planting design and hopefully get more success. So that's the primary research question that this planting will address. And it was supposed to go in the ground this spring, but like many things this year, it's been set back by COVID-19, and so we hope to be putting the stems in the ground next spring. And on this map, you'll also see some little black squares, and what we are doing there is, it's more for demonstration than for scientific rigor, but I think it's really important as we're putting these small deer exclosures up. And you can see Dan here along with 2 residents of Hinesburg who came out and helped install them. So we installed all these small deer exclosures throughout the planting site, and we'll be planting trees within them. And, they may not cover a lot of ground, but I think they'll be very revealing to the effect that deer have on the success of planted trees. And from personal experience actually at the site I was just showing you earlier, we erected a 30-acre deer fence that's 8 feet tall to protect 5,000 American elms that we planted there. And it's a wonderful thing, and it's incredible to walk through and see the success of the trees inside the fence versus the fate of those that are out. I mean, it's night and day. And so I think that having these small exposures will be really revealing, because to be honest, I felt like we were a little bit in denial about the effect that deer are having on the success of our plantings, and really they have a very outsized impact is what we're beginning to find at our site in Hubbardton. So on that note, with both the elms and the deer, I want to focus on or switch gears and talk a little bit about our American elm restoration effort, because we will be planting actually this Friday 35 disease-tolerant American elms at this site as part of the planting design. And you know, maybe this is a familiar story for many of you. It was the story I knew about Dutch elm disease when I first started at the Nature Conservancy. Was, you know, we had these beautiful trees lined with American elm, and then in a flash they were gone. And what I didn't really know was that a similar story played out in our floodplains. So American elm was once the dominant tree in a fully mature floodplain forest throughout much of the Northeast. And it's actually maybe throughout much of the Eastern United States. It's the American elm is a tree that has the most widespread range of any native tree species in North America. And while you'll still see plenty of elm out there, it doesn't reach its full maturity. The disease kills it at a young age, and it never really reaches its full ecological maturity. And this is a photo from Saskatchewan that shows what a fully mature floodplain forest might have looked like in New England. This is one of the last areas that was exposed to Dutch elm disease, and you can see just this kind of remarkable towering canopy of American elm. And I think that there's plenty of evidence that suggests that this was similar structure to our New England floodplains. And in fact, ecologists call American elm a foundational species. Maybe you've heard of keystone or umbrella species. A foundational species is one that is really, it defines the structure and function of an ecosystem. So American elm is kind of part and parcel with a fully mature, fully functional floodplain. And without American elm, our floodplains are incomplete and they're vulnerable because there's very little diversity in our floodplain forests, particularly up north where it's really only silver maple. So you can't really think about floodplain restoration without thinking about elm. That was really the realization that got us into all this work. And so when we first started, there were only a handful of different varieties of disease-tolerant American elm available for restoration. And so here are some of our earliest plantings. You can see they're doing really well now. But there simply wasn't enough genetic diversity to do widespread restoration, right? If each tree is a clone of a single disease-tolerant parent, there's at best maybe 5 different genotypes that are disease-tolerant. So we partnered with the Forest Service to try and increase that genetic diversity, and we've sampled from over 80 trees in New England that we think are survivors, and they've been bred against trees that the Forest Service has identified as survivors. So they've gone through quite a bit of rigorous screening. So we have 12,000 American elms, planted in Vermont and at sites across the Northeast. And many of these are these experimental trees that have novel genetics. And we will grow them and then expose them to Dutch elm disease and see which ones make it and which ones don't. And then we'll be able to go back through and trace to figure out which genetic combinations and which parents had the good genes that we want to propagate. So that's the big experiment part. And then the other piece is that there are now more than when we first started. There are more than 2 or 3. There's actually a handful of disease-tolerant American elm cultivars that you can do for restoration planting. So what we are doing is what we call these sentinel sites, where we have taken 5 of the best trees and we are planting these small groups at sites all across the Northeast, because we want those good genetics that are captured by these selections to be spread across the landscape so that they can start breeding, creating new novel genetic combinations, and dispersing good seed to sites all across New England. So that will be how we'll start our chapter of restoration at the LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest on Friday. I'll be out there with a small crew if people are interested in joining. feel free to shoot me a note. You can leave me your name in the chat box and I'll reach out to you and if we can, if we need the extra help. And we'll be putting those in the ground, and it's a very nice way to start off a project. And with that, I want to turn it over to Ethan to talk about the other good work that's going on at site.
All right, so I am gonna zoom through this here. I probably won't quite have time to do all of it because I want to leave some time after 8 o'clock to get to your questions. But I'll give you an idea. And again, it's just so cool to be able to. It's just so cool to be able to work with these guys, especially on account of how my work is largely in the woods, you know, and what I usually deal with is what I'm about to talk about, which is what we call like woody invasive plants, terrestrial invasive plants, which if you own a piece of forested property, this might be what you're struggling with. And I don't really know anything about planting trees or about restoring floodplains. And so it's been such awesome partnerships to work with these guys on this work because I really don't know what I'm doing. And so it's nice to work with folks who really, really do. And they've made the project so much better. And I think the LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest is going to be so much healthier for it as well. So we've known that there have been invasive plants, again, invasive exotic woody plants in the forested portions of the LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest for a long time in a general way. And I think our understanding was improved. We facilitated a UVM group's capstone project, this class called NR 206, which is like seniors do it. And they did a really good job of mapping invasives at LaPlatte. And so we had a clearer idea of the extent of the infestation. So then starting in 2019, we generated some revenue from the Old Town Forest, where we've been doing a demonstration forest management project over the last 2 years. We generated a little bit of income and we turned that around and used it to fund some invasive plant work, controlling invasive plants in the forested portions of the LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest. So in addition to these floodplains being really important for water quality and aquatic habitat, forested areas really are too. That's where the water starts in most cases. And so we wanted to also make those areas more resilient, more healthy, and supportive of those riparian qualities. That's one of the main reasons that we want to protect the LaPlatte Headwaters. So we just completed our second year of that treatment, which was done with invasive control contractor named Will Dunkley. His company is called Trout Lily Forestry Services. He did an excellent job. So just quick primer on invasive exotic plants. Exotic meaning they're existing outside their native range. Invasive just meaning spreading prolifically in a way that is in some way harmful. So in this case, we're talking about it is harmful to ecosystems and to our native biodiversity. Of our about 2,800 plant species, about 600 are thought to be introduced. Many of these are naturalized. These are our field species or agricultural species. Most are not considered invasive. So we're actually dealing with a subset of those exotic plants that we consider invasives or invasive exotics. In a global context, it's just really important to recognize that biological invasions, which we call them when a sort of invasive exotic plant, insect, animal pathogen establishes in a new area, are a major threat to global biodiversity. They account for about half of all extinctions, of which the cause is known. And according to the National Wildlife Federation, 42% of endangered species are primarily threatened by their interaction with biological invasions, invasive species. So obviously we're not dealing with brown tree snakes, but in Guam, this is an example of the havoc that can be wreaked by an invasive organism outside of its native range. So in Guam, the brown tree snake has caused 10 of the 12 native forest bird species in Guam to go extinct. The other 2 are considered functionally extinct. So it's basically made all the birds go extinct just by introducing this species, which isn't co-evolved with the native species on that, in that case, an island. So woody invasive plants have a lot of similar attributes to one another. They're fast spreading. You guys know this if you're dealing with it on your land. They're generalists, so they can grow pretty much anywhere. They're allelopathic in many cases, which just means that they are injecting chemicals usually into the soil or exerting other chemical controls, which are inhibiting the germination of other species. So an example of this is that the herbaceous invasive exotic plant garlic mustard injects chemicals into the soil which inhibit the growth of mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi are the beneficial fungi that connect different tree and plant species and allow them to uptake nutrients from the soil much more readily. And most species that we have are really, really dependent on those fungal networks. Garlic mustard is not. And so when they kill all the fungal networks in the soil, they're able to succeed. Most of them are really resilient. So this is why when you cut a buckthorn down, I say you're just making it mad. They are capable of surviving while being antagonized intensely. You can cut them and cut them and cut them, they stay alive. You can pull them and every root fragment will sprout. They're also really good at layering, which is just sprouting from any piece of their stem, and they just stay alive. And also many of them have seeds which are spread by wildlife, and they seed very prolifically, which helps new populations get established. Common in Vermont, these are some of the big ones that we deal with: shrub honeysuckle, common buckthorn, Japanese barberry, Asiatic bittersweet, multiflora rose. Less common in Chittenden County, but still prominent in the state are autumn olive and Russian olive, glossy buckthorn, which is an up-and-comer, black swallowwort, burning bush, and some of these and so those are all woody invasive plants that basically make wood. Non-woody plants to be aware of: Japanese knotweed, Phragmites, garlic mustard, and of course reed canary grass. And you can learn more about all these different invasive plants at vtinvasives.org. All of those woody invasive exotics that I mentioned there are present in the LaPlatte Headwaters Town Forest, less than there were a couple years ago. So why do we care? What's the big deal? Well, I almost always show these two slides that I'm about to show in any presentation I do. It's just really important to recognize that while we think of forests as these sort of unchanging, monolithic landscapes dominated by big trees, or this is what we sort of want an idealized forest to look like, is these evenly spaced single age class of big trees with nothing growing in the understory. In reality, forests are dynamic. So they rely on the processes of natural regeneration, which is in large part what Gus and Annalise's projects are trying to stimulate. Natural regeneration is what makes forests work and are so much more diverse than any regeneration that we can introduce, right? And so what these invasive exotic plants do is crowd out native species and interfere with the forest's ability to regenerate. They establish in the understory in many cases, and then following a disturbance, they'll take over, or they'll just sort of take over in the understory. And they don't allow these natural processes, which include disturbance and death and change in the forest, to occur. And those are the processes that make forests really complex, that make them have great wildlife habitat, that makes them resilient to climate change and natural disturbances. We actually want to encourage a dynamic, changing forest. And this constant cycle of growth, disturbance, regeneration is completely derailed by these invasive exotic plants that we've introduced. It's also really important, as Annalise alluded to, we need to recognize that forests are providing, and Gus alluded to, forests are providing massive benefits to all of us. So they're providing the oxygen that we breathe, the water that we drink. They are not something that, you know, you can sort of take or leave. They are literally providing, forests and other ecosystems are providing the foundational resources that allow us to live here. And while many of those resources in Vermont are produced by private lands, Vermont's 75% forested and 80% of those lands are privately owned, the resources they produce are public and they impact all of us. So when I talk about invasive plant control, in many cases, I don't talk about eradication because I don't think it's possible. I think that on some level, these plants are going to be with us forever. But I talk about control. So control is lowering the infestation of these plants to a level at which they're not interfering with the forest's natural processes, and specifically a level at which we can control them, pull out plants when they're young as they newly establish, without having to use some of these more drastic methods like chemical control, herbicide, and stuff like that. If you deal with these things when they're a small patch, they're very easy to deal with. They're not costly. You don't have to do anything that makes you, want to hold your nose. But the problem is when they're a small patch, either you don't notice them, you don't know what they are, or they don't seem like they're a problem because it's just a little patch. What are they doing? They're not interfering with anything. And then it becomes a big patch, and suddenly you have less options about how you're going to control them, and your forest is increasingly degraded the longer you let that go. These plants are never going to get better on their own. They will just get worse. And so inaction is itself a choice with respect to these plants. Mechanical control, this is sort of something we'd all like to do. without using chemicals, we can hand pull them, we can girdle them, we can burn them, we can cut them. Sometimes these work. It depends on the infestation. If you have a couple plants in your yard, great, pull them up or cut them and keep on cutting them. On a scale of a larger property like LaPlatte and in an extensive invasive plant infestation, it may not be feasible. So it requires a lot more physical energy. It requires years of repeated visits over and over again in order to actually kill those plants. And in my experience, with mechanical control and a large invasive plant infestation, it's not that people can't kill them this way, it's that they don't, because it requires too much energy and sort of stick-to-itiveness. So, which is the reason that in many of these treatments, many of us, most conservation organizations in Vermont use herbicide, not in the way that is, that we're all scared of, where it's being sprayed all over our food and sort of indiscriminately broadcast across the landscape, but as a restoration tool to protect native biodiversity. We apply it in a minimal way to individual plants, and we're using it, we sort of use it in the opposite way that you can think of the way it's normally used. So I was just reading a book about massive plantation forests in New Brunswick, where they use herbicide sprayed from planes to inhibit the growth of natural regeneration and so they can only have a single species of tree that they want to grow. We're doing the exact opposite of that. So we're spraying herbicide in a super, super minimal targeted way to allow natural regeneration to occur and to protect our native biodiversity. What I've realized is that if we want to protect our native biodiversity across the landscape on a large scale by controlling invasive plants, which we do, herbicide, it's not that it might be part of that solution, it will be part of that solution. And so coming to grips with that is a big, big step for a lot of us in saying, okay, how are we going to proactively deal with this problem? Most people, instead of using herbicide, they do nothing. And for those of you from Hinesburg, you know that there's like 2 people in the world who this is not the case for. Ann Donegan from Hinesburg is one of them. And there's like 2 others that I know of who are just like such forces of nature that they're able to control invasive plant infestations mechanically. For most people, it doesn't work that way. And so it's sort of come full circle for me, where now I'm like, what's really radical is not categorically rejecting the use of herbicide, but saying, okay, I know that this is a challenging decision. However, I understand that this is an important part of how we're going to protect our ecosystems. And so I'm going to be willing to do this uncomfortable thing to make our ecosystems more healthy. 2 different types of treatment: cut stump treatment, where it's applied directly to the surface of the stump. We did a lot of this at LaPlatte. And also a foliar spray, which is a much lower concentration, is applied to leaves and kills the plants that way. It's appropriate for plants with smaller stems and stuff like that. This can also be very targeted, and actually I'm going to use the work at LaPlatte Headwaters to demonstrate how targeted and surgical it can be. You can see places where we used a foliar spray, killed an individual buckthorn amongst a massive amount of regeneration, and didn't kill a single non-target plant. Okay, so this will be the last slide, and then we'll take some questions because I know we're over time. So this is the rundown of the invasive work we've done, starting in 2019. Again, taking that revenue from the Hinesburg Town Forest that we generated by selling local renewable resources as part of this big forest management project that I was really excited to be involved with, and used it to hire invasive control contractor. We determined that the infestation was too significant, that hand cutting just wasn't going to work, or hand pulling. So we decided to use chemical treatment. The second year of the treatment has been concluded, and significant progress has been made, the kind of progress that would have taken many years or decades and countless hundreds of hours of work with mechanical treatment, if it would have even been possible. And we view this as part of the broader strategy, which includes the work that Gus is doing, includes the work that Annalise and others are doing, as how do we protect water quality, aquatic habitat, and also terrestrial habitat, forest health and resilience. All these things are connected, and how do we do that across the landscape in a broader sense? Finally, I also, with all these things that I do, I also really want to use this as a demonstration tool, showing people how, or raising awareness of the importance of addressing invasives and showing people how they can do it, and demonstrating what that looks like, so it's sort of not this big unknown. You can actually go see where it's been done, and empower people to start dealing with invasive plants on the landscape, because this is what, on a broad scale, what we really need to do to protect all of our water quality, our wildlife habitat, and our forest health. And that with that last slide, I'll just share vtinvasives.org, which is a website run by the state of Vermont where you can go and learn about invasive plants. Now that's a whirlwind version, Annalise, through all of this. And so with that, if you guys have if you guys have any questions about any of this, please pop them in the chat. Let's see. Everybody just thinks we did a really good job. So no questions from anybody. One thing I'll say, just in case, to give people a couple more minutes to put in a question if they have one thing I'll say is that it's been really fun, specifically working with Annalise's project, because with these riparian restoration projects, so I'm managing forests, and we don't plant trees in the forest usually. We're like creating openings, and the opening is stimulating like natural regeneration, tens of thousands of seedlings per acre. And so I don't have to worry about like an individual tree, right? Like I'm like, yeah, one died, another one will make it. And so it's really, the concept of keeping an individual tree alive stresses me out. And so I really like the idea of that sort of, really with both of these projects, moving from like a single tree model to like an area wide model. We're not trying to keep each, 100 individual trees alive. We're trying to regenerate an acre, for instance.
Right. Like the concept with our work is really to reset the stage for restoration. So, I mean, in a sense, this is what you might call passive restoration, even though we are being active in creating that condition. But then hopefully we won't then have to go back in and plant individual trees. We can rely on nature to take over and create the forest that we're hoping to restore.
I got a question here. Maybe this is for Gus, because it's an elm question, but please chime in as well if what you think, Annalise. From Karen McKnight from Underhill. Hey Karen, where they got some knotweed stuff going on that we've dealt with in the past. Is there evidence that elms provide enough shade to deter Japanese knotweed?
Oh.
Geez, I mean, elms are like the super tree, but I don't know if I could answer yes to that, unfortunately. I think that you see knotweed getting established in floodplain forests underneath ostrich fern and silver maple, both of which make really dense canopies. And it's hard to imagine that even the majestic elm could throw that much shade.
I think that for any of us, probably knotweed is one of the most virulent, if not the most virulent, invasive plant that we deal with.
Yeah.
Very difficult to control.
Yeah. And has a real fondness for floodplains, which is discouraging.
Very discouraging, yeah.
Yeah.
So I got another question from Annette. Hey Annette, about burning. And so Annette, I haven't personally done burning. I know that actually the Vermont Land Trust has been doing some work with it, and up here, the Jericho Underhill Land Trust as well. Burning, I've heard it mostly applied to Japanese barberry. So Japanese barberry has all these buds, basal buds around sort of the base of where the plant meets the ground. And I think people have had some success with burning. There's other problems associated with it. It still takes a lot more time. And obviously you got to do it under the right conditions, right? Because, fire is increasingly not something that we're messing around with. But that's the only one that I've heard about burning for. Gus and Annalise, have you heard about any other applications of burning for invasive plants?
Well, that actually came up as an option at LaPlatte Headwaters, so burning reed canary grass. And we ended up shying away from that for a couple of reasons. The first being just the logistics of it can be really challenging, especially at a site like this that's right by a road. So having the right conditions and being able to ensure you can control that burn. And in reviewing the literature, we also found that timing is really critical with burning. And if the timing is wrong, it can actually, kind of like you mentioned, make it matter. So you can burn it down and it just encourages it to, it's sort of like the ash will fertilize it and then it will come back stronger than before. So we decided to not go ahead with burning.
Yeah, there's a couple. I mean, honestly, with a lot of these things, like we don't use herbicide because it's like something that we really like, or feel comfortable with. And I think a lot of this stuff is adaptive, you know, and some of this stuff at LaPlatte obviously is explicitly experimental, but you know, as different approaches emerge, we're gonna you know, sort of change our management strategies accordingly. And if we find a way, you know, to use something else that's like really effective and we don't have to use herbicide, we will definitely do that. Mm-hmm. Not that I think that, like, you know, herbicide is something that's like completely unacceptable on the landscape, but just because, you know, we obviously want to do everything in a way that's, you know, has as little potential harm and as much potential upside as possible. So we use herbicide because it works, and because other stuff doesn't work, and because we think we can do it in a way that is really not going to damage our ecosystems. But there might be other methods that are out there that we don't even know about yet, and that would be that's really exciting to sort of think about. Mm-hmm. From Betsy, hey Betsy, from Betsy, Asian bittersweet, best way to target. I know what I would do. Do you guys have thoughts about bittersweet?
It's my least favorite invasive.
Yeah, it's there.
Bittersweet freaks me out. On my land, I killed one bittersweet vine and have found carpets of bittersweet seedlings. It's absolutely incredible. And they also can sometimes have, quick anecdote, on a county forester retreat, we visited a very small state park that had a really advanced invasive plant infestation. And there was one guy who was retired, who just decided that he wanted to get all those invasive plants. So he spent like all of his time out there pulling up invasive plants, and he dug up a bittersweet vine. He pulled it out and showed it to us, that had a root that was 100 feet long. And it was like, the root was like out of sight. It was incredible. And so they have this really, really incredible root system. What I would do, Betsy, is I'm a big proponent of a tool called Buckthorn Blaster. It's a little $6 modified bingo dauber. I know that Pat's got one, and others. It's a really, really cool way to apply herbicide to the cut surface of a stump in a way that's applying it like super targeted. It doesn't spill, it doesn't get anywhere, and it only is applied to the surface of that individual stump with a minuscule fraction of an ounce of herbicide. And so I would use herbicide concentrate, and I would cut the vine, and then I would treat it with that. But you have to expect that there is some seeds in what we call the seed bank that are going to sprout. So those are new seedlings that you'll have to deal with. New seed sprouts like that, a lot of times they don't have a very good root system. So you might even be able to cultivate them like with a circle hoe or something, or just pull them up by hand. But I would kill the seed source, kill the vine, by cutting them and then treating the stump with herbicide. The Buckthorn Blaster, you can find it here. I'll type in the website.
Well, Ethan does that. I just wanted to go back to a question I'm just seeing about, from Catherine, about what other herbaceous plants seeded beyond woody species, and if we used a cover crop. So I was kind of rushing at the end to get through this, but I intended to spend a little more time describing the really exciting mix of native wet meadow species that we saw recruit after we killed back the reed canary grass. And it was just cool to know that they were lying in wait in the seed bank, essentially, for an opportunity to establish. So we saw both common milkweed and swamp milkweed, boneset, Joe pieweed, some different sedge species, all species that are characteristic of floodplain natural communities. So to us, that really spoke to the significance of controlling reed canary grass as the first step, like I said, in resetting the stage for restoration. And then hopefully next year we'll have some better success with establishing some of the trees and shrubs from seed. But we were also heartened knowing that just controlling the reed canary, I think, will provide conditions that will allow for the restoration of trees ultimately. You know, it might take a few years, but you're going to have conditions that that will ultimately allow for that natural succession we're hoping for.
And I just put in the chat, you can also just find it by going on YouTube and searching for Chittenden County Forester, but I did make a video on doing a cut stump application, and it's like 6 minutes long, and it's on there with the Buckthorn Blaster, and you can find it. And you'll also be able to find On that channel, you'll be able to find a recording of this video as well. And there's also, there's another webinar I did, I think back in April, where we dig a little bit more into the specifics of how we actually treat these different plants, which is a recording that is also on there. And the other thing that I would like to plug is that the Nature Conservancy has a great guide for dealing with terrestrial invasive plants, which is really, really comprehensive. It's not like a one-pager, it's like a book, which is an awesome resource that we use all the time. With that, are there any other, oh, so Annette also asked, can you map invasives and their spread, or do they show up too randomly? So what I would say, Annette, is that both things. So they tend to spread in patches. Invasives tend to make areas where other invasives can also proliferate. And they also are introduced to different areas in a way that's sort of random, and that's usually by animal dispersal, right? By birds eating the seeds and then pooping them out. One thing that I do on my property is I use a navigation app that's called Avenza. I'll type that in. Avenza is an app that allows you to, if you have a PDF map of your property, which you can find an export of through a number of different websites, the Agency of Natural Resources Atlas or something like that, you get a geo-referenced PDF, which is just a PDF that has information embedded in it that tells you where it is in the world. And then you can navigate on it. It shows where you are with the blue dot. And so on my property, I know where the bigger patches of invasive are or were. And when I'm walking on my property, I have my smartphone. And if I find a new patch or a new individual invasive, I just pop a point on it. If it's a smaller property, you could hang a piece of flagging, or maybe you can just remember. But it's hard to predict where they're going to end up.
The Nature Conservancy was part of an effort to create like a crowdsourced invasive species mapping platform. It's called IMAP Invasives. And for a variety of reasons, it was kind of difficult to maintain and hard to get the number of observations that it would really be necessary to think about it being a statewide resource. And instead, now, to be honest, what we do is we recommend people use iNaturalist as a way to report infestations, which is another app for your smartphone. It allows you to take a picture and upload it with a GPS point. And that's a really great way to capture that information if you're concerned about seeing things in on state and other conservation lands, and you want to be able to share it with somebody.
It's also, iNaturalist also is, if you're not sure what these invasives look like, it also has artificial intelligence and also this really dedicated community of people that you can just like take a picture of it and it'll tell you what it is, or someone will like let you know what it is in a very short period of time. So it's fun because you can learn to identify stuff that way, but you can also tell what's an invasive plant that way. It's a really cool app.
It's unbelievable. I took a picture of a beetle once on a whim, and an expert from Belgium confirmed that it was the dead nettle leaf beetle, and it was like the first observation in the United States. It's unbelievable, like in 24 hours. To have the beetle expert, Europe's beetle expert, confirm something was pretty cool.
Logan asked, this is a woody one, so I guess I'll take this one. Can you treat honeysuckle and Japanese barberry with the buckthorn blaster during the same time of year as buckthorn, which I think is late summer to early fall? Yeah. So we say the best time, the most effective time to treat woody invasive exotic plants is late summer and early fall, and that's because they're sort of like sucking everything down to their root system. So if you were to cut them and apply herbicide to the surface of the stump, they're going to suck that down into the root system. You can also, though, apply almost any time of the year, and it's pretty effective. It's not as effective, but it is very effective almost at any time of the year, except for the early spring when they're really pushing sap up. When, as you can imagine, you cut a stem and the sap would just push that herbicide right off the surface of the stem. So like June through February, I think you can do it. And for most people with, who have their own piece of land and are just sort of plugging away at it, what I say is you should do it whenever you have time. And just because it's such a big project and it really needs to be done. And so if you can't get it done in August and September, treat in the winter, treat in the summer. That's the most important thing, and you'll get most of it. Barberry's tough with the buckthorn blaster because it has a lot of little stems. On my property, I ended up using a foliar spray for barberry for that reason, but you can definitely do it. I've done it before. All right, gang. Well, so with that, I think I'll say thanks to Gus and Annalise and all of you for hanging with us. If you have any other questions about any part of this, maybe we can just quickly type our email addresses into the chat. And feel free to use this as a resource. And also, if you have no other people who wish they could attend, but weren't able to make it, I know that you'll be able to look this up on my YouTube channel. Gus, will it be up on Nature Conservancy or?
I don't think so.
Okay, so look it up on, just search for Chittenden County Forester on YouTube. And also, if you want to stay, we've also got a forest management project, demonstration forest management project that's going at the Andrews Community Forest. And I also try and share events that other conservation partners are putting on. And so if you'd like to be kept apprised of those events, please do send me an email at ethan.tapper@vermont.gov, and I'll put you on my mailing list and keep you posted about the stuff that we're doing if you're interested in this kind of stuff. With that, I'll say good night. Thank you all.
Yeah. Thanks for hosting, Ethan.
Bye.